Hello, beautiful people. In today's episode, I am joined by Brandon Zhang. Brandon is 19 years old and he is an incredible creator. He is somehow balancing being a creator full-time as well as being a student full-time. And it's a real joy to watch Brandon write, podcast, and just put out content on the internet. I was so impressed by him and what he's done that I said, hey, Brandon, want to come on this podcast? Because he is someone who's way ahead of where I was at 19, and I'm sure where a lot of people are at 19 years old. And so in this conversation, we spoke about his long-term view at 19 years old, how he manages to balance school and posting online, why he started his internship with Jack Butcher and what he's learned from it. We went into topics like a dopamine detox, and we just discovered and went into the mind of Brandon, and it was a really fun conversation. So I'm looking forward to your feedback. If you have any feedback for this episode, let me know on Twitter. @HeyDannyMiranda is the best place to find me and the best place to let me know about what you think of this episode. And now, without further ado, this is my conversation with Brandon Zhang.
Interesting people, thought-provoking conversations, nutrition for your brain. Journey through the minds of the world's top performers and discover what it really takes to achieve your highest version. This is the Danny Miranda Podcast.
Why don't you tell everyone just a little bit about yourself?
Yeah, for sure. First of all, thank you for letting me come on the show, but I'm Brandon. I am a freshman right now at Columbia University, and I guess other things about my life is I also have my own podcast, and I think that's kind of like early on how we met, kind of through that and Twitter and everything, and it's just been such a cool journey. I think whenever someone asks like around when I started kind of all this online stuff, I would say it's pretty much basically towards the end of kind of my school year last year, like right before summer started. So it's been around 5-6 months now, and it's just one of the most rewarding things that I've been doing.
Yeah. So I got in contact with you because of your writing, because of your podcast. You're just creating a storm around yourself. And what's most impressive to me about you in general is that you seem to take such a long-term view at things. And I'm curious where that came from.
Yeah, I think for me, it's when I think like, I guess like especially that kind of shines through when I write, is that I try and emphasize like, I think I like just writing is such a cognitive activity in terms of like, if you write about your future goals, future plans, at least for me, it just naturally feels like it makes sense to kind of put out your long-term ideas and to really think about like, how can this affect me in the future? Because in the moment, right, like it's hard to take account of everything that's going on. But if you're like looking at the more long-term picture, you can really kind of evaluate like, why am I doing this? What kind of value or leverage am I building out of it? And am I actually enjoying it? And it would be something I want to do in the long term, because at the end, that's like, for me, kind of what it all kind of boils down to.
Makes a lot of sense. And another thing that stands out to me when I think about you is that you just move so quickly. And, you know, we scheduled this interview for this podcast on Sunday, and then you book it right away for Tuesday. And it's rare to have a guest just want to go and be on that same page as me, where I'm just like ready to go, next guest, and you're on that same page of like, you want to go quickly, you want to move quickly. I remember one time you were saying, yeah, it's going to take me 25 newsletters to be successful with this, but that's not good enough for me. I want to move quicker. And I'm curious where that came from, that ability to just want to move quickly.
Yeah, I think part of that is just like by virtue of being on Twitter, right? Like you have such fast feedback loops on your ideas, where kind of when you put them out there, you get a ton of comments, a ton of engagement. You can kind of use that to kind of see where you're at with what you're doing. And I think it's just been kind of one of those things that's always been built in, is that I really feel like the people that move quick are kind of more optimized towards not just, I don't want to say success, because I feel like it's a really one-dimensional way to look at things, but they just have that comparative advantage. I feel like if you're able to act fast on ideas, right, whether that be like taking note of it and actually implementing it, or even just like taking fast action on opportunities. I feel like, right, always trying to hit the anvil when it's hot, right? Like for me, a lot of people ask me like, what is your number one advice in terms of networking on Twitter, or like reaching out and getting other guests on? And the reality is just like finding the right moments, but that usually comes from finding the right timing. And that's because, like, let's just use I think one of the things that people ask me the most is like, how did you get James Clear on the podcast? And it was honestly just, I think it was, a lot of it is luck, obviously, but kind of the moment he followed me, I just kind of really reacted. I sent him a personalized message about like my favorite takeaways from kind of his newsletter and Atomic Habits, and also just kind of dropped it in there that I was doing this podcast. And he was really open about it. I think that it was just by virtue of like him, right? I recognized that he made the conscious decision to click follow, and that there was like some level of interest there, and that if I didn't follow up right away, right, like that level of interest might wane. Whereas if I wait 2 weeks to like craft the perfect message, like he might not even know like why he followed, might not remember why he followed in the first place. So just always having that bias towards action is really valuable.
Yeah, I really like what you said about taking advantage of the moment, because I think this is something that we need to think more about in terms of, especially on the internet, you can get so many things could happen. And when you have a moment of someone following you or someone retweeting you, you have to take advantage and capitalize on that, because otherwise it could be a moment lost and an opportunity lost. And you had a great podcast, then you parlayed that into a great podcast with James Clear, which everyone should check out. And I'll throw in the show notes at dannymiranda.com/podcast. And it leads me to ask, who are some of the people that you look up to? You have James Clear, and that's what strikes my mind. Is he someone that inspires you? If he is, who are some other people similar to that?
Yeah, I think that kind of basically what I've tied down to who comes on my show is like anyone that comes onto my show I look up to, right? And I think that's the great thing. It's that there's no kind of set niche. It's kind of like yours, where I'm just really talking to people that inspire me every day. And that comes in many different forms, right? It could be someone who's considered really successful, like James, right? Like a #1 bestseller. But it's also just people that I think have a lot of skills and tools that I really look up to. Like, for example, I had Robbie Crabtree, who runs Performative Speaking. Robbie and I have been really close friends for a long, long time. And basically the thing I really wanted to take away from him is like what went into the story of creating Performative Speaking, right? What went into, like, how did he notice it was an actual skill and like an actual process he was doing differently? So I think it really is a variety of things. I think that basically you can look at the guest list on the show, and they're all people I'm trying to like extract information from. Like I say it all the time, I feel like having a podcast is almost a little selfish in terms of like you're trying to get things that you're interested in and you're concerned about answered for you. And obviously you're sharing that with everyone, but for me at least, it's a lot of the questions are kind of things I would ask. I try to engage on Twitter to get other people's perspective, but at the end of the day, like, it's just almost like unconscious that you're kind of the one leading the conversation. You're kind of like trying to see like, how can I understand this better in terms of my own perspective? And basically that kind of leads you down that route. But to get back to your actual question, like people I look up to, I think that everyone I look up to has one thing in common, in that they're kind of leveraging the internet in one way or another, right? It could be people that are building businesses around the internet strictly through the hiring process, outsourcing process. I look up to those people, but I also look up to people that are creating content on the internet, right? Like a David Perell, like a Jack Butcher. I think that what they're really recognizing is that there is nothing more valuable right now other than your own time, other than an audience, right? Like it goes back to that idea of fast feedback loops I talked about before, but it's also just a group of people that you've built enough trust with, you've built in a rapport with, and it's hard to find now. So I think that's something that's like a consistent base layer to anyone I'm kind of like observing.
I'm so happy you brought up Jack, because Jack Butcher is someone you're now doing an apprenticeship for or an internship for. I'm not sure what exactly to call it, but you reached out to him, if I'm correct, and you then started to work for him for free in an attempt to learn from him. What was your thought process when you said, okay, I want to work for Jack Butcher?
Yeah, so it was honestly, it's an interesting story. So it started out with Jack just coming on my podcast. And I think from that moment on, I don't want to make assumptions on behalf of Jack, but we've talked about this a little bit afterwards. But I think he was really impressed with some of the questions I asked, just in terms of like the depth and how they weren't kind of the typical things just about like the story of visualized value or like why he left his agency business. But it was like very much trying to get at the core values of visualized value, which are mental wealth and independent income. And I think from that moment, he after that, he gave me access to the two courses that are on visualized value. I took them and I was really impressed. And basically, it was actually in this moment, right? I was taking an online course called Rite of Passage that's run by David Perell. And one of the modules in it is kind of all around like this idea of networking via cold email, right? Because David's experience himself, like he was able to meet people like Tyler Cowen, like Neil deGrasse Tyson, and get them on his podcast using effective cold emails and find opportunities in that manner. Like he was just trying to share like some of the tips and ideas that he had. And one challenge that everyone in the class, in the cohort did was, right, go ahead and write your own cold email. I kind of cheated in that I had, I guess like I talked to Jack before on the podcast and I had cold DM'd him. But I kind of treated it as something different, right? Like as a completely cold email, because I was kind of pitching myself as, here are some things that I think you guys can improve on, and I would love to do them for you, basically. And so I think at first, like you said, like you mentioned, it was free, right? So it was kind of hard for Jack to basically say no, right? Because who doesn't want some help, some feedback, right? And I think he kind of knew that because I did the podcast, like I had done my homework. I know what visualized values is about. And so kind of we worked on that for around a month. And by the end of the month, right, I was going to start my first year at college. And at this time, we also found out at the same time that my college, which Columbia, wasn't going to be having in-person classes, right? So I kind of, on a call with Jack, I was just like, oh yeah, I'm going to be staying remote for the next semester. So I think we could still kind of work on this, and I'd love to help out. And Jack was super receptive. We kind of worked out a deal, and so actually it's kind of like more of a working agreement now, but I would still be doing it for free because it's like, even if I didn't get compensated because it's such a good learning experience. I think I treated it as Jack is a mentor that I can go to with any questions, but also, right, like I'm trying to help him out as much as possible because I believe in the mission of visualized value, and I want to help kind of him get to that point. And so it's really been an amazing kind of two-way communication, and then it's become a really good experience for me to have.
Okay, let's go back to that first interaction. You mentioned that you found some things that you could add to visualize value. What specifically were those things?
Right. I think that in my initial email, I think I have it up in an article, but I think I mentioned a couple different things in terms of helping him change things with the community. The Visualize Value has an exclusive premium community that I think could have introduced some new things. I had some ideas for. I thought that that had an opportunity for kind of a podcast around specifically ideas that Visualize Value is kind of working on. That has kind of evolved into, we're going to be doubling down on YouTube a little more, focusing on increasing the content there. And I think the last point is just like leveraging the newsletter as well and building out funnels, which we're currently doing in ConvertKit. And so it's just been such a good experience to kind of see progress actually have been made from some of my suggestions.
Okay, so you brought up newsletter, and I want to talk about your newsletter and specifically. You now have, I think, over 3,000 people subscribed to your newsletter, and you started in March, correct?
Yeah, I think so.
And it's like, how does that happen? That right now we're recording in early November, so we're talking about 8 months maybe, and 3,000 people on your email list. That's pretty incredible. Talk to me about how that happened exactly.
Yeah, I think that part of it is just pure luck. I think that I have had a couple of my articles on my blog do really well in terms of like SEO, and so that has helped in part. But honestly, I didn't know much about SEO coming in, so I would really attribute that to just like picking the right topic at the right time. But I think some more tangible advice for me, at least, like when I first started out, I was kind of, I feel like you said, this around probably April, probably have been publishing for 2-3 weeks now on the email list. And one thing that really worked for me was like I was on Twitter at this time, but I had really little followers. And there was just a group of people that I kind of met by virtue of like, I guess like who I was following at the time, who were talking about creating like a little mastermind group. And I thought the really interesting requirement was that it has to be people that are under 1,000 newsletter followers. And I immediately knew I wanted to be a part of that, because normally you think of mastermind groups and it's like they're really exclusive, right? Like they want you to have more than 2,000 followers or some sort of requirement base level like that. But I think the great thing about like that group was that we were really focused on how we were all really early stage. And basically it was a weekly call. I still get on the call. We've expanded a little. We've built the group up from the original, but it's around 8 of us now that basically every Sunday we kind of come together and discuss one thing we did differently this week, one thing we want to do differently next week, and then one newsletter that we thought was really good this week. And that's just been such a good mechanism of testing different ways to improve, like, and keeping me accountable for making actual changes to my work. And it's just such a good system in terms of like having someone to go to or a group of people to go to share your ideas and really get feedback from them. Because sometimes you have really bad ideas that sound good and appealing initially, but after a bit of conversation, which is kind of all you need, you kind of realize the pros and cons. And I would just like to give a shout out to, it was organized by KP. He's pretty active on Twitter, so most of you guys probably know him as, he does a lot of no-code stuff, building in public stuff. He just kind of like did his entire job recruitment in public. He's now working with On Deck as their head of like the no-code program. But I love KP, man, and it was great that he put that group together so early, and it was like I would attribute everything to that group.
KP is someone I spoke to for one of the previous episodes of the podcast. At the time we're recording right now, it hasn't been published yet, but it will be published when you're listening to this. And great guy, and I highly recommend you check out that interview and that podcast. And about newsletters specifically, what are some of an idea for someone who is just starting their newsletter? What actionable idea would you give them? Is that to start or join a group of someone who's doing that as well? Or what would you suggest to someone who's just starting out?
Right. I think that's a pretty actionable piece of advice, but something that is the most important, I'd say, is really develop a habit on how you publish, right? Like a lot of people have different formats of how they do their newsletter. And just like at times, right, like some weeks it can be hard to write and it can be hard to find ideas. So having something that you've really mastered, you've really kind of know like, oh, I answer like these 5 questions about this topic, and that's kind of like my thing. or I curate resources on these topics, and that's kind of my thing. Like having something that is able to give you kind of like a baseline kind of motivation every week is really, really important, because above all else, consistency is what matters for your newsletter. And so for me, my newsletter is kind of just a curated selection of the best articles, ideas I've come across in the week. And the system that's worked for me is that I use Instapaper and Readwise, which are kind of apps that accumulate highlights during the week of articles, books that you've read. And they all sync to Rome Research. And I have this one page in Rome Research, which is called Inbox. And it's just all the things, all the little highlights I've read during the week. And kind of at the end of the week, I'll kind of go through that inbox and pick out like, what are kind of the tidbits that I want to expand on, that I want to connect with one another to make up this week's newsletter. And so that's kind of like, right, you're no longer starting from nothing. You're starting from 50%, right? You're not staring at a blank page. You have a bunch of ideas out there already. You just kind of have to refine them a little. And I think I tweeted this. It honestly only takes me around, I'd say like 45 minutes to write the newsletter each week, because like I'm reading these articles throughout the week. I'm taking notes on specific highlights. I'm thinking about like how I want to piece them together, right? After I read one article, maybe I read another article that rebuts it or follows up on it, right? Like I've done a lot of the work. You have to do a lot of the work beforehand to get into that rhythm. But I also know there's different styles of newsletters, right? Like people publish completely original content around it. People like Packy, or people that like, it's basically a long form blog post. And that's like another, like it's a style of habit that you have to develop, right? I've talked to Packy on the podcast, and he's someone who's like very much got into a schedule where he has to send out his draft to his brother by a certain date. But just like giving yourself that structure is super important to writing a newsletter.
And what's so fascinating is that I think that you raise such an important point of when you start something, it's going to be difficult. Those first 5 times, it's going to be like, how do I do this? How do I format this? But as you get going, and as you get through the process of writing, and any habit really, it becomes easier, because you know how to attack that habit. You know how to attack that newsletter. And so, yeah, did you find that as well, when the first few issues were the most difficult for you, or quote unquote the most difficult, and then as you got more experience in sending your newsletter out, you found, oh, this is easier than I thought it would be?
I think it's a combination of both, right? Because I feel like you definitely said, there is a little bit of it, right? Like the operation side of things it's pretty difficult, but it's also like you're really excited at the start, right? Like you have a lot of drive at the start. So I think that almost kind of balanced it out for me for a little, where I was like at a really consistent pace where I was feeling pretty similar about the newsletter each week. I mean, recently I've been feeling it's a bit harder to be as inspired, but because of like I said, the system in place, right? Like I don't have that many excuses, right? Because it's there in front of me. Like it's almost like I'm doing a disservice if I don't write this week, because I've done like 80% of the work just by virtue of doing the reading. And so for me, it's a little bit of a U-shaped curve, at the start, where it's kind of like, it's at the start, you're kind of like an upside down U-shape. I guess it's the N shaped, where it's going up, right? Because you're feeling more inspired, but your system's getting more optimized. But the end, like you're losing a bit of that inspiration, but your system's kind of carrying yourself through it.
Makes complete sense. And so let's talk about that for a little, the inspiration aspect of it. What has caused you not to feel inspired recently, or since starting it? What is that piece that's missing?
Yeah, I think that one thing recently was also like, for me, it's like I'm not super technical in terms of the email stuff. So one week I had like a little bit of a dip in terms of my open rates. I think I might have gotten like a complaint or something. I'm not sure why. Maybe I posted too many links to my podcast at the start. I'm not really sure. But I had like a little bit of a dip in open rate. And obviously right? I try not to let those statistics or anything like that really affect my day. But kind of like, right, when you're thinking about the point of you're writing this newsletter, you want as many people to see it as possible. So seeing that little dip kind of affected me a little bit. And I've been able to bounce back from it recently, right? Because one, like the open rate has gone back to normal, but also it's just like I've kind of like shaken that off in terms of not letting stuff like that really define kind of like how I feel on a certain day. But I think like it's just you have to recognize like I think like it's very easy to be discouraged about something when you feel like you're not being heard. You're just speaking kind of into the void. And so for me, right, like if I don't get as many responses, email replies, Twitter DMs kind of around the newsletter, like I'll feel like I'll start thinking like, was it not as good this week? Did I not find the right content for the audience? And so there's always like these small moments of self-doubt. But I think, and that's just kind of happened more recently, I feel like, because I've been more experienced, right? Like I've experienced days where I've gotten a lot of feedback and days that I haven't. And so it's just kind of like that adjustment phase where I'm slowly learning that like anything in life, there's ups and downs. And it's just kind of almost not something you can control. It's just something that happens based on the week and the content that you kind of curate that week.
Yeah, and you mentioned this in your user manual when you said, you're a victim of the hedonic treadmill at times and you get caught up in growth, and when it slows down you get discouraged and you want to attain the same level of growth. And my question to you is why have you been so open and honest and transparent about yourself on the internet? Because that's a difficult thing to admit for a lot of people, or to even notice. Some people don't notice that. So why are you so open and honest and transparent?
Yeah, I think that it's just by virtue of seeing a lot of things on Twitter. I think like people are super comfortable sharing. I think that one person that you've had on the podcast, I think I think that he's been a big inspiration in that manner. Just like a lot of his tweets are honestly just stories and being really open and honest about his journey. I think that it's just, you see a lot of dividends because people are not only understanding you and where you're coming from, but like a lot of times like they'll be like, oh, I was in a similar position, or oh, I also suffer from the hedonic treadmill. And those types of connections are the best because they give you kind of a same launching pad, right? Like normally when we meet someone in person, like the familiarity is things like, oh, what sports do you like to watch, or what TV shows are you watching? And those things are all great and all, but it kind of feels like it's the same things over and over again. Whereas just by virtue of creating content online, you're kind of giving yourself a bigger surface area than that. Like you're connecting with people on other topics and areas that you probably normally wouldn't have. And that leads to some really cool connections. I think that by being open and honest, like that's the only way for you to create meaningful connections on the internet.
It's so interesting because you would never walk up to someone, right, and say, hey, my name is Brandon. I sometimes fall into a victim into the hedonic treadmill, and this is who I am. And that would be odd, right? But on the internet, if you write that in a post and someone's just finding you for the first time, you're in essence saying the same exact thing. And it leads you to just have such a deeper connection, like you said, with that person. And so it's so important. And I really want to drive this point home for anyone who's creating content on the internet is like, put your flaws out there. If you put your flaws out there and you're honest, it leads to just, one, people trusting you more, two, people knowing you're a human being, three, it makes people want to reach out to you and be like, oh, wow, same thing for me. So couldn't agree more, man. One thing you talked about that I want to bring up is the dopamine detox, and it kind of falls in line with the hedonic treadmill. And so you've said you've done a dopamine detox before. Talk to me a little bit about this.
Yeah, so I think that I was just kind of browsing, I think YouTube one day, and I saw a video on it, and I was just like, I was kind of like in the middle of summer. I was like, I think I could do this for a day, and it'd be a cool experiment to write about. I was really in a writing mode for those couple of days, and basically a dopamine detox is, at least for me, I set my rules as no screens and um, limited kind of interactions almost in terms of that. It was really just a space for reflection. And so I spent a lot of the day walking, reading, and journaling. I think there are some levels of the detox where you're not even allowed to read, right? And you're mostly just left with your thoughts. But for me, like that was just something I would have never thought I would do before. I'm normally someone who's really kind of I wouldn't say like jumpy, but I like to be doing things. I like to be active. And just having that big, I guess, like antithesis to like what I was doing was pretty eye-opening in that it taught me a lot about like, right? Everyone's been talking about like learning to say no, and everyone's been talking about to learn about slowing down, like moving away from that hustle culture. And I think that that was a really good way for me to see that. And I was definitely someone, right? I went to a very competitive high school. It was a boarding school on the East Coast. Some would call it like a top 20 like feeder school, something like that. But like before, I would say like in my high school, I was very much in tune with like how hard can you work. I mean, I was always someone who would like to find shortcuts and work smarter, not harder. But like because of the culture I was surrounded by, right? Like oftentimes I would also find myself, right, like putting in too much effort into things that I didn't need to, or just because everyone else was doing it, I felt like I needed to. I wasn't a hard worker or something like that, right? Like it was a place where a lot of people compared like, oh, how little did they sleep last night? Even though I never resonated with that, I always tried to get like my hours in. Sleep has always been a number one priority for me. But right, like the detox was a big turning point in, for me at least, seeing like the importance of being mindful, right? And like how much more productive you can be if you take like a mindful approach as opposed to a hustle at all costs approach.
So, with that being said, you've changed your schedule, and so you've written about your schedule, and it was really fascinating to me and put it into perspective about, I believe it was a maker schedule versus, I'm not sure exactly what you separated, but I remember thinking, wow, that's a really interesting way to think. So, how do you think about your schedule these days?
Yeah, so that article was based on this idea, this essay that Paul Graham, the founder of Y Combinator, wrote about, called Maker Schedule and Manager Schedule. And his was more targeted towards kind of like people in the startup world, right? Like engineers, creatives, coders, and basically saying that, right, if you're an engineer, you're a maker, right? You're creating something. You need a level of creativity. And if you're stuck with daily meetings that kind of interrupt your workflow, you're not going to be as productive, right? So he really advocated for people that do create to really focus on trying to get these 3 hour long blocks where you're just allowed to kind of immerse yourself into work. And so kind of like around the time I was writing that article, like I was kind of like getting more followers on Twitter. I was getting a lot more requests to do calls, to do podcasts. And I found like it was impacting how productive I was, right? Like school was probably starting around the same time. I had to do, right, like my orientation workshops and things like that. And it was just like really reflecting on what schedule worked for me, which is, right, like having a couple days of the week where you just have 3 to 4 hours blocked out to work on a project, to do some design work, to do some writing, to do some podcast editing. I find that really soothing almost. It's a very enjoyable kind of thing to do for me. And really getting into that flow state. I know a lot of people kind of like to talk about it, but I honestly only think it's possible if it's for long periods of time that aren't really interrupted. And so that was kind of the thinking behind sharing that article, right? Like you have a bunch of consistent times blocked out, right? Like you have it's not an attack against time blocking. I think some people thought it was. I still block out time every day to like do my workouts and things like that. Like things that I do consistently every day, I still block time for. But I just felt like some people were really overdoing time blocking, that they're blocking like every 15 minutes, right? Like you can spend time to take a step back, breathe, and relax. Like it's just like this idea of time blocking was so populated by people like Bezos and Gates, right? Like they should be time blocking, right? Because they're owners of these massive companies and they really need to maximize every second of their day. And they have people that are blocking their time for them because their time is just, they don't even know what they're doing with it, because it's such a constant battle with how much they have going on. But I think for the regular person, right, like you don't have to block out every single second of your day. And so it was just a combination of those factors that made me write that article.
So what is a typical day look like for you?
Yeah, I think it's changed a little since school started, but I have school 4 days of the week. So I'll do one day where it's like I have school and one day where I don't, because that might help. But I think the great thing, I think Shane Parrish tweeted this a couple of days ago, but it's pretty like common advice in that I try not to have too many meetings kind of early on in the day. I try not to have any calls until like 11 or 12. But one thing that I do usually like to start my days off with is I talked about Robbie before, but Robbie and I on Fridays every week, we get on a call for an hour and just write. And so we'll kind of brief each other on what we're focusing on at the start. We'll go through the hour or so, and then we'll end, and then we'll debrief each other, see how we're doing. And it's just a good way to check in, good way to keep ourselves accountable. And it's good ways to be productive, right? Like it's almost like I'm competing against Robbie. I like competition, and it helps me become more productive. But that's usually around 8 to 9. And then I'll work some more just on my own stuff from 9 to 10:30. And then 10:30 to 12 is always a workout. So I go on a run kind of in the neighborhood. It's still very nice out here in California. And then I do a workout in the basement. And kind of then from 12 on, it's a lot more kind of free space. Some days, if I don't have many meetings, I'll block out another 3 hours then to do work. But that's then when I'll get on a call with Jack to talk about visualized value, or I'll kind of do a podcast like I am today, or I'll kind of get on a call with someone that just reached out on Twitter to learn about what they're doing with their product. And so that's what a typical weekend looks like. And I'll kind of wrap up by the afternoon and really spend some time reading. I always spend time, like at least I try and give myself like an hour to go through Instapaper or some of the new books that I've picked up. But on school days, it's a little different because obviously classes are interjected in there. And I try and do my homework for school on the same days as that I have class. So it's kind of like some days where it's like fully dedicated to school, and some days are fully dedicated to other things on Twitter. And obviously it's like there'll be times where kind of time commitments will shift and that structure won't hold, but I like having that general structure in place.
What's the hardest part about managing an online personal brand, putting out online content, and also going to school?
Yeah, for me, I think it's like sometimes when I try and explain it to people, they don't really get it. I don't blame them at all. It's really kind of an absurd concept, and not in a negative way. Just in it would be really foreign to me. Like even if I had heard it a couple months ago, I think it's just like people my age or kind of around my age just associate influencers with people with like fully fledged video creators around kind of ideas, and not as much people that are kind of geared towards almost like education in terms of like you're trying to teach people your experiences or share with people a new type of content in a process to do something, or how to improve yourself, how to improve your writing. It's just like, it's kind of hard to explain. I'd say that's a challenge, as well as just the time commitment. I think I wrote about kind of my mindset going into college, like what I'd be able to maintain. And I think I've honestly been pretty happy with it, right? Like my goal is to do, I think originally it was to do one blog post, one newsletter, and one podcast a week. I called it like the 1-1-1 framework. Like that was the goal for a while. And then I kind of realized I had to shift it. Whereas I was getting really into the podcast space, that I was having a lot of good feedback from guests and stuff. Like I was really getting into the rhythm of that. So I wanted to do 2 podcasts a week, sacrifice the blog post, but maintain the newsletter. And so that structure has been working for me. But yeah, I think the saddest thing has just been having to give up online writing, because I have to do a lot of writing for school, and writing something that just takes up a lot of thought. I still got to kind of do it through the newsletter and through writing tweets and stuff, but I think like having to give up long form writing for a little bit has been tough.
Makes a lot of sense. And when you're going to school, for me, going to college or university was a period for me about, making friends and socializing, but seems like it's pretty hard to do in 2020. So how have you gotten around that, or how have you made friends while going to school? Or have you just been like, I'm going to make friends on the internet and screw my classmates? Like, how have you thought about making friends in 2020 going to college?
Yeah. That's a great observation. I think I'm just someone who's always been I placed like having friends in classes as like a really high priority for me, because like at least for me, classes that I know someone in, or like I just feel someone I'm close to with, like one, I'm more likely to go because I'm like, oh, I got to see this person. But it's just like someone you get to work with, someone you get to talk about the class with. So even though it's online, I've been pretty kind of proactive in reaching out to different people, whether it's be through friends of friends or just someone I get placed in a breakout room with, just like connecting with them afterwards, after class and things like that, and just trying to build relationships that way. And I think like really being on the internet has helped with that, right? Like being on Twitter, like being comfortable getting on like calls with someone, right? Like that's helped me a lot, I feel like, compared to other people. I don't want to sound like pretentious or annoying, but like I honestly think that I'm a little more comfortable getting on calls with someone than someone who's typically just like think of like the traditional way to make friends, where it's you have to see them in person, you have to meet them. And so I've definitely tried to be really extroverted and proactive in reaching out to everyone. And so I fully agree with you in that, like the reasons I'm going to college are probably, I like this tweet from Michael Pick, he just tweeted out today, but he kind of talks about his journey going to an Ivy League, and his takeaway was that he took away a lot of intangibles, where it's like discipline, right, pattern recognition, work ethic, and the last one was building relationships. And I'm like, that's a really important point, right? Like the key for him was he was out here like making connections with people. And so yeah, I would just say like for me, it's always been something I've valued. So I've been putting a lot of effort into it, just by way of like looking to connect with anyone I can.
Is there any idea of when you guys are going to go back to school in person yet, or that is to be determined?
Right now, I think for us, it's still to be determined. Like there's some rumors about something happening spring semester. But yeah, I think it's an interesting balance there. Some Ivy schools are in person right now. I know Cornell and a couple others are open. So I think it's just a case by case basis, and they're saying they're keeping us updated. So I think we'll see actually what's going to happen.
Awesome. Well, I hope you go back to school soon, and let's change gears a little bit and talk about something that you've changed your mind on in the past 3 months. I'm curious if there's anything in particular that you thought one thing and now you think a different thing, particularly in the last 3 or 6 months.
Yeah, I think that one thing that was a big change for me, right, was I thought for a while, kind of when I was starting out, that my intended audience would be students or like at least people that are kind of around my age, right? Right. That was kind of the idea behind a lot of my early content on the blog. That was kind of like the idea behind the name Student Mindset. And even if you look at the first couple of episodes, it's all college students that I'm interviewing. But the big change for me was I kind of noticed that, one, a lot of people that follow me on Twitter are not students. I think that a lot of people that listen to my podcast are older than me, are kind of not kind of like who I thought was going to be my audience, which it kind of made me realize and reflect on like what direction I want to go in terms of like I no longer want to like super double down onto just like limiting myself into this sphere of like teaching students. I think I've connected with so many cool people working at Visualize Value on the podcast that it's no longer had to be just kind of this niche.
That makes a lot of sense. And what's so interesting about student mindset in particular is that student in that context could be just referring to a student of life. And that's what I thought of it as a 25-year-old student of life, that, oh, you know, if I could just apply the mindset of being a student to everything in life, then my life will be better off. And I'm curious where that name came from, student mindset in particular.
Yeah, I think I was just, at first I didn't have the student of life thing in mind, but then I like slowly realized like that was a good fit. And I think that that's just such a interesting concept that so many people can benefit from. I think that really it came from this idea of, I think it's really interesting to be a constant learner. Like you're always trying to improve and upgrade yourself. I think that a big inspiration for me early on was like Tim Ferriss and the Tim Ferriss Show, right? And he really doubles down on like high performers. But if you really break that down, it's people that have the ability to pick things up really quickly. And so that's kind of like why I realized like that was such a cool name for me. And I was always big on mindset. I was always big on like I think after the detox, that was kind of a big turning point for me, in that I realized like having the right mindset, the right frame of mind is a big indicator in what's going to happen.
So what are some of the ways that you seek out to improve your mindset, or that your self-talk or think like when you think of mindset, what do you initially go to?
Yeah, I think for me, when it comes to mindset, it's a couple things. I'm a big fan of, I don't know if you know Anne Lore, she writes Nest Labs, but I'm a big fan of her kind of ideas on mindful productivity and that entire focus where, right, like you're still aiming and you're trying to optimize to be productive, but you're doing so in a way where you understand how your brain kind of works and thinks. You understand some of its biases, some of the psychological, like neuroscience ideas behind it, and you're trying to apply that to how you can find that balance between being, right, like you're being too mindful just for the sake of being mindful, but you're also not hustling until you burn out. And so that's always been kind of the zone I've been in.
It's finding that balance in terms of figuring out where you can do what you need to do and go as hard as you can, but also realize, you know, we're just monkeys on a floating rock in space, and how do we get here? No one knows. So yeah, you know, it's like holding those two at the same time is really important, I find.
Fully.
So another random question, but I got to ask you it. If you could have dinner with one person, who would it be?
Dead or alive, or alive?
Dead or alive. Up to you.
Ooh, there's some good ones.
With this type of question, it becomes almost too much. You have so many options.
Right. I think that just by virtue of kind of what I've read recently, I would really want to have dinner with Daniel Kahneman. He wrote Thinking Fast and Slow, and it's kind of like, it's so fascinating. It's about kind of how our brains work. We have two kind of systems where one is kind of our automatic habitual decision making, and another is kind of our slower deliberative decision making system. And I would be so curious to see how he thinks, because I think some of the experiments, the ideas he came up with, like on how to observe people, is so interesting. So I would really want to talk with him. I'm actually not someone who's super into science. I'm more of a history, humanities type guy in college, but psychology and him in particular is really fascinating to me.
I just highlighted his TED Talk on memory and how we have two different selves. We have the remembering self and we have the present self, and how we interact with those. And I highly recommend everyone listening to check out that TED Talk, because it's just incredible the way he breaks that down and what it means for our own happiness. Before we wrap this thing up, Brandon, why don't you give some wisdom to the listeners of this podcast? I know you've got a lot of wisdom in you, and I'm super, super curious what you have to give to the listeners of this podcast.
Yeah, I think I'm always nervous to label myself as someone who can dispense wisdom, just because of my age. But I think, like I mentioned before, I'm just kind of used to that now, right? With a lot of the audience being older than me. But I think one thing that not enough people recognize is, right, like me and Jack always talk about this idea of permissionless apprentice. And you can see it in play a lot of the time, and it's just so effective. And so basically the idea is that we're kind of conditioned as humans to wait for permission to do something, even though we fully have the capacity to go out there and do it ourselves. And because it's so rare, like when you see it happen, it means a lot to you, right? Like for me, the permissionless apprentice was writing a bunch of these documents to Jack about, like, here are some things that I think you can improve on, and here's where. It's not the greatest example. I've seen it done by so many people better, but like there's people that you see here. I think another great example was a couple months ago, you saw this girl, Alyssa X, and she posted a video that went viral about like some of the design projects she was doing, which are amazing. And she got basically, like, I think she posted an article about it. She got like 73 like design job offers. That number is probably wrong because my memory didn't serve me, but there's so much value in terms of like producing something for someone, producing things for yourself, and just posting out there in public, or also just posting it in with a specific call to action, a specific cold outreach. And it's just like by far and away more effective than a cold email, right? If you have something, if you go up to someone and say, if you go up to a brand and say, let me, this might be hard for a brand, but if you go up to someone and say, let me do something to you for free for 3 months without pay, and you can see the results, will you let me do this? And obviously, like, they'll have to trust you with kind of not sabotaging their brand, but let's say you get to proof all their tweets and ideas and things, but it's just a lot more value, right? Like if you go up to a brand and say, I'll build a website for you from scratch, right? An alternative website with better copy, with better graphics, that is better than any resume and than any cover letter that you're going to send to these people. They'll probably hire you on the spot. And so I just think that there's a lot of different creative ways that you can do this. I think that people are doing this by virtue of video editing, by virtue of web design, but also things just as making like a Notion template for someone, making a Notion database. I think one person that does this is, I have a close friend, Tem. His Twitter handle's Optimization. He's like a big Notion guy, and he runs a Notion consultancy, but he does a ton of permissionless apprentice stuff. Like, I think on Twitter, he saw someone release like their own Eisenhower matrix, and he basically just upgraded it with a bunch of his advanced Notion features and ideas, made it 10 times better, sent it to this guy for free, and sent a Loom recording of how he did it, like teaching people how to get to his level. And probably from that, he earned a bunch of like new eyeballs, new goodwill, new leads. And it's just a method that I think it's not very traditional, but you can use it for a ton of different things, not just to get a job, not just to get a freelancing gig, but really as a way to it's like a way of life almost, right? Like we're always constrained by waiting for someone else to give us permission to do something.
And you are living it, my man. You have proven that it works, and it's incredible to see. So where can people find you on the internet?
Yeah, so I'm probably most active on Twitter at Brandon the Zhang, Zhang. And I usually try and respond to all DMs. So if you guys want to chat, feel free to reach out. They're always open. I also, like I said, like Danny said, have the podcast if you guys want to hear more of this voice. And yeah, usually that'll take you to my website where you can sign up for my email and all that good stuff.
And those will all be in the show notes at dannymiranda.com/podcast. Thank you so much, Brandon, for joining us today. It's been an absolute pleasure to learn from you. You're wise beyond your years, and hopefully we will be learning from you for years to come.
Thank you so much, Danny. That means a lot to me, and it's honestly been an amazing experience coming on the show today.
That was my conversation with Brandon Zhang. If you enjoyed this episode, let me know on Twitter. @HeyDannyMiranda is the best place to give me feedback about this episode. If you'd further like to support the show and support me, you can sign up for my weekly free newsletter, Tuesday Treasure. You can find that at dannymiranda.com/Tuesday. Thank you for listening until the final seconds. It means so much to me. I appreciate you tremendously. And I look forward to seeing you in the next one. Peace.